So, it's kind of like building something and not knowing what you're building and then trying to figure out what you built after you built it. You
Right.
got to know
That's
what you're
right.
building in advance, right?
That's
And the
right.
same is true for impact. So you got to have some intention, and you have to have a little bit of purpose up front, so that you know exactly what it is you want to measure when it comes to measuring impact.
Well, tell me a little bit more about that. When you talk about impact, you've already used words like the business impact, the uh, sort of results of that learning.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I'd say traditionally in learning, some of the things I've heard around why it's challenging is that there are so many factors that be contributing to that business
yeah,
impact, right? How do you actually linearly tie that back into the learning? Tell me a little bit about,
yeah.
what you mean when you talk about impact and some of the things that you have seen folks be able to do successfully, even as challenging as it can be.
Yeah. I'm really glad you asked that question, and I want to go back to a part of what you led in with. So, when we think about measuring the impact of learning, I think that what makes people a little uncomfortable is this idea that um, you're trying to attribute something as having happened only because of training and learning. So,
Right.
here's the reality: that won't happen, because what we're trying to measure is performance impact, or the influence of learning on behavior, performance, and actions, right? So, Christine, if you think about it, there are multiple what I like to call activators
Mm,
that that trigger performance, right? So let's think about some of those things. Some of the things that trigger performance or activate performance include things like rewards and recognition, compensation. Everybody wants to get paid, right? That's a motivator. Manager support. What about natural ability? How about that? What about tools and technology? So there are different types of things that activate, and trigger performance. As part of those activators and triggers, we can also include learning and development. So yeah, when we're thinking about all those activators, or what I like to call inputs into performance, the question then is, how do we determine what came from training and learning, what came from something else?
that's right.
Yeah, one of the things that I like to use to get at the answer to that question whenever possible is pilot testing, or
Mm,
what may also be called A/B testing, right? Or control groups and test groups.
yep.
So for folk who have joined us today who don't know what that is, right? So you have two groups, right? You have one group who has the learning experience and another group who does not. So that group that does not get the learning experience, they're not being penalized. We're not withholding it from them. We want to conduct a test. So the test group is going to be the group that has the learning experience, and then the control group would be the group that does not have the learning experience. So then you can take a look at the differences between those two groups when you are looking at the facts and the evidence and data that lead to showing, are there any differences in performance? Are there any differences in business goals? Are there
Mm,
any difference in any metrics that we can take a look at that compares the two? So the only difference between those two groups is that one had a learning experience and the other didn't. And so that's one of the ways that we can create what I like to call a reasonable preponderance of evidence that shows the extent to which training and learning influenced behavior, actions, and performance based on those differences that we might see in those two groups. So I think that classic A/B testing, or control group, test group, or pilot testing, that's a lot of terminology, but it all leads to the idea that what we want to do is be able to compare two groups, because as we both said, right, there are a lot of things that influence performance.
that's right.
Training and learning is just one of them. And so if you have those two groups, and you know that the variable for one of those groups is that they had a training or learning experience and the other group didn't, I think that that's when you can begin to draw those fair conclusions, that there was something different about a measure that was based on one group having a learning experience and another group not having a learning experience. The other flip side to that, Christine, may be that you don't see any differences at all. How about that?
Right.
And right, and that may lead to the idea that the training or learning solution was not effective, or there may be some
Right.
other dynamics. And that's where the work comes in that I talked about, right? So the work is possible, the work is achievable. It it just requires you to roll up your sleeves, and get a little dirty with data and look for those answers.
Well, are you willing to share any examples of that work? Our listeners love to get some sort of tactical things that they can take with them and maybe try with the folks that they're engaging with.
Yeah, absolutely. I worked with a business once, and we had a pretty expensive leadership development program. It was a global program, and it was slated for a great deal of investment in talent development. And by investment, I mean good old dollars, right?
That's right.
So we did some pilot testing in a specific part of the world, in one of the regions in which we operated. We put high potential leaders through a program, and we had specific behavioral outcomes that were firmly rooted in leadership competencies and leadership behaviors. But before we launched this program out to the entire world, we just wanted to determine the extent to which there were any measurable differences with some measuring instruments that we used, pre-program and post-program.
Right.
And one of those instruments that we used was a Leadership 360,
Okay.
which gave some actionable data on leaders' performance and leaders' behavior, based on what their direct reports were saying, what they said about themselves, what their leaders said about them, and even what their customers or their clients had to say about them. And so we were able to use those data points as well as some other internal data points to see if there were any differences in those data points and the same data points that we had for people who had not gone through the same program. And so the essence of what we saw was an uptick, in some of those measures that we were using. And we saw some measures that didn't change at all. And
Yeah.
that's okay. That's okay. Again, to kind of reference, the L&D Detective Guide and Principles, the fourth one is find at least one thing about a person's behavior or performance that you can attribute to training or learning and let that lead to the facts about impact. So it's not always about trying to impact 20 behaviors or even 10. Sometimes five may be too many.
That's right.
For me, if you can measurably activate performance through training and learning, and change one behavior, I think that you've been successful. So that would be an example of a way in which I was able to use data, and business metrics and people performance metrics to show the extent to which, we could attribute a change based on training and learning.